Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I represent the institution which, in fact, it was created 12 years ago. And it's a daughter organization, a daughter institution of the European Commission, responsible for the transposition, actually is a watchdog of transposition and implementation of the EU energy acquis in all fields of energy, and actually in all sectors except for nuclear energy, in its contracting parties. I will talk about the contracting parties later, of course, including Ukraine. And it serves like a mechanism for pre-accession of the countries to the European Union. So our, for example, previous contracting parties were Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, the latest members of the EU. So being probably a one and single European officer here in this room, I will have to defend the very notion of the EU Energy Union, because during the last panel we heard several skeptic approaches that this regulation is not necessary. And actually what we are taking steps in the energy community, and in particular the European Commission, is completely the opposite way. You cannot talk now about kind of coming back to the nationalization of energy policies. This is a totally medieval approach of the problem. And the European Commission is taking a completely different step. And this is a very right moment to talk about, because last weekend I had this reading material, the so-called winter package, which was leaked from the European Commission, and it will be officially announced sometime in February. And it has a completely reviewed Regulation 994 of 2010, which is the National Gas Security Regulation, and also a completely different approach on dealing with the intergovernmental agreements which the European member states are concluding with the third parties, and, well, primarily, of course, Russia. So I will talk about this a little bit more from the foreign perspective, because what we are working at the energy communities is more related to those countries which are cooperating under certain framework with the European Union but are still not members. And while talking about the energy union, I want to stress that the borders of energy union doesn't end with the borders of the European Union. The dependence on external supplies were stressed tonight, well, sorry, this evening, still not midnight, couple of times. And of course, I will stress it once again, because this is one of the conditions on which the energy sector in the European Union develops. So these are the same 5 dimensions pointed out 1 year ago by the Energy Union package, and I will try to describe each of them later on, how they do reflect with the foreign policy of the European Union. So common energy policy, well, that's a very, very deep question, both from the legal perspective and from the perspective of political sciences, whether we have a common energy policy. So traditionally, under the EU law, we have 3 layers. We have the traditional sovereign competencies of member states. We have shared competences which are transposed partly to the European Union, and then certain decisions and actions are being made commonly by cooperation of EU institutions and member states themselves. And we have the layer, the EU competences, which is completely so-called exclusive competences, shifted and transferred to the European level. So now where the energy union and the energy policy stands in this regard. If you could take a look at the very traditional scheme which you could find everywhere, what's the scope of energy policy of the European Union? So you have 3 main pillars: the security of supply, competitiveness, and sustainability. And if you take a deeper look at these pillars, you would see that correlation with partners, correlation among the countries, among the member states, is crucial. More and more we live in the global world, and actually national actions are, well, they actually prove themselves to be inefficient or not sufficient enough. And this is actually the standpoint from where the third energy package came into effect. Because the traditional economies, the traditional energy sectors based on incumbent monopolies, shown to be completely deteriorating the very idea of internal market, and of course absolutely not viable in terms of the consumer's protection. in terms of the market economies. So if you would take a look at each and every aspect, I will not go into the details. It's clear that we cannot rely anymore on national actions. And this is the key line, the so-called the so-called solidarity principle. This is a very, very beautiful and the very kind of tremendous flag of the energy policy. But yes, the solidarity and common actions is the way forward. So what about the energy policy in this regard? It really comes into the shifting of competences from the member states, even from the shared competences, to the EU competences. And this winter package shows extremely this trend. Well, actually, it was shown many years before. If you could take, for example, all the directives, electricity and gas, starting from the first package, then the second package, and the third one, you will see how many competences were transposed to the European Union, to the high level, I mean, where the decisions are made at the EU level by the competent EU institutions, and then imposed actions are being put forward and imposed measures. Now, one of the best examples here, we are discussing about energy union or national sovereignty. Forgive me, guys, but in 21st century, we don't have such thing as national sovereignty in common policies. We have a need of common actions, and national sovereignty is, of course, a beautiful name for our identities, for our cultures, and this is a different topic. But when we are talking about economic policies, and especially the energy, which is one of the key components of the society, and we are talking about European Union as such, we have to understand that sovereignties are being given to the EU level. Now, the biggest example actually is one of the triggers about the energy mix, whether the energy mix is a national decision-making policy or not. Well, I should say that it is shifting to the EU. And here are two examples. Renewable energy sector. Now we have Renewable Energy Directive, and it will be soon reviewed. And the stakes probably will be much higher than they are required right now. And who could have believed 10 years or 20 years ago that someone will impose the countries to have certain renewable energy balance in its energy mix? Now we have these obligations. And our contracting parties of the energy community do have the same obligations. The second example, nuclear safety. Now we're not talking about the idea that each country can decide whether to build the nuclear power plant or not. Well, first of all, you have to comply with nuclear safety requirements. And these political measures and regulatory measures which will cause the shift of competences in structuring, designing the energy mix in the countries will go deeper. And with the gas security of supply, the reviewed regulation, this is one of the examples. Now the question is whether it is good or not. I will give you an example from Lithuanian perspective, which quite, it was in the media a couple of months ago. The investors signed certain preliminary agreement with Chinese investors to build the CHP here in Kaunas. And then there was a question, what fuel will be used? And one of the options is coal. Seriously, guys, 21st century, and we are talking about introducing coal to the country which for decades it's not using coal for the energy conversion. And of course, when these kind of decisions are being considered, so I start, I catch myself thinking that it's a very good idea that someone sitting there in Brussels will make much better decisions what and how we have to build. I'm not criticizing Lithuania, and I'm always saying that I'm very proud to come from this country because our LNG project is one of the key examples on how this works. On the other hand, European Commission doesn't like this example too much because those who were working with the LNG project know that the study purchased from the European Commission and performed by the Booz company, the American consultants, said that Lithuania doesn't need the LNG terminal. I mean, it will be sufficient for Lithuania to have this JIPL, the connection with Poland, and then to have certain regional terminal up there in Estonia and Finland. And thanks God that the previous government had guts enough to stand for this position and to finance, partly of course from the state funds, partly from the loans, the implementation of the project. Now it's the worldwide example of the success. So, The other aspect, which I want to touch a little bit, is of course the energy dependence. These are the key partners, and of course this is the gas sector, since I'm mostly working with the natural gas these days. And you can see the overall partners, trading partners of the European Union, which have certain stake in our natural gas market here in Europe. And here is an example showing the dependence of the countries of natural gas imported from Russia. And here Lithuania is already, this numeric value of LNG terminals perspective, or the influence is not that big, but the moral influence and the political value is much, much bigger. So, but I just wanted to illustrate that the European Union is dependent on its partners, and of course there could be examples for nuclear fuel, for example, because still Russia stands as the main importer, the main outside supplier of the nuclear fuel, partly in electricity as well. So the energy partnership for the foreign policy as regards the energy union, and to make it work, we have to find the way to turn the dependency into the partnership, because well, it's pretty physical. I mean, it's a daily routine. If you have some relation with another person and it's a clear dependence, then you are not happy. But then you have a full value partnership, then you are happy. So this is one of the key aspects of the external factor of the energy union. Now, if we talk about the overall partners, of course, Russia stands, well, it's always discussed about that, and I stop here talking about Russians. The Eastern Caucasus countries, Caucasian countries, they're very important also as a base for the European policies and as potential transit countries. Turkey, a potential member of Energy Community, is a key country now in talking about these diversified transportation routes from the Middle Asia. And I should say that, well, Turkey is still negotiating and it keeps kind of silent and joining the energy community. But they transposed actually most of the provisions from the third energy package. They are extremely progressive in the legal and regulatory scheme. Then the energy community, this means Ukraine, Moldova, and Balkan countries and Albania. The Northern Africa countries, which are also the suppliers, and the potential traders, including United States. So the energy community, here is a map, you saw it in the Anton's presentation. We expect Georgia, finally, after more than 3 years of negotiations, to join the family this September. And actually, the key idea of the energy community is to prepare the countries for deeper cooperation with the EU, or potentially for the membership, for the EU membership. Now, cross-border energy union, I'm coming to the final touch of my topic. Going through these energy security, through the dimensions including the energy security, first of all, we have to talk about the transparency of supplies. And that's why cooperation, for example, first of all with Ukraine is very important. And thank you very much, Mr. Ozolin, for the compliments. We were working very hard for the last 2 years, actually, with Ukraine to have this law adopted. And now we are going on with the finalization of the draft secondary legislation for the gas market in Ukraine. And, well, I have to say that Ukraine is definitely the champion of the energy community. It goes fast forward. Well, we would like to expect the same progress further on. The other aspect is diversified supplies, sources, and routes. So the European has to look forward how to find other partners, and United States is one of the targeting partners for potential LNG imports. And here comes the importance of the LNG technology. Cooperation on security measures. A couple of years ago, we had this Ukraine crisis started, and immediately the European Commission launched this so-called stress test project, and the energy community participated together with the EU member states in this check. But it is always better to take over the preventive measures than to react when the crisis starts. But actually, that was a very good trigger. The problem is here talking about solidarity, and I mean the representatives of Lithuanian institutions talked about solidarity very much. And there should be no critique, of course, for the Baltic countries here in this regard, because, well, Lithuania especially is one of the most Euro-optimistic countries, probably the most, according to the latest polls. But the thing is that certain EU member states forget in which union they are, and there is a tricky thing, because they are eating a lot from for example, from the funds, from the structural funds of the European Union, and then they're biting again against the same hand. And especially, I have in mind Hungary. I'm always criticizing Hungary very much, and it's a pity that Hungarians are not present here, because we had a couple of years ago this discussion in Vienna several times, when the South Stream project was a big issue, and Hungarians were defending it a lot. The partnership with Mr. Putin was so friendly. But then the South Stream project just popped up like a hot air balloon. They kept teary-eyed, and they don't know what to do now. What's next? How to please Russia further on? Because South Stream is not going to happen. So you see, this is how certain countries, and of course the Hungarian approaches might be to build the walls around their country, and not to participate in the energy union, for example, initiatives. But they have to. But they have to if they want to be a partner and they want to stay in the union. Now, emergency preparedness, of course, is one of the key issues which will be tackled now in a reviewed Regulation 994, and it will be the discussion for this year a lot. The internal energy market, first of all, of course, this dimension was touched already today, and first of all, it's of course a physical development of the interconnections. It is very important. Now, me as a lawyer, I have to put forward also another aspect. This is the legal and regulatory aspect. And the export of the EU law is here very important. Here we stand with the energy community as probably the biggest exporter of the EU acquis to our contracting parties, because the members of the energy community have to implement fully the third package, for example. Also the Renewables Directive. And we hope that after the review of the Regulation 994, it will be approved also for our contracting parties. Now, regulatory enforcements, it is always important to have an independent and well-balanced regulator in the country. Again, we're working with our countries a lot on this. In Ukraine, we still have this issue. We just discussed with Anton that the new regulatory law will probably move forward after more than 1 year's discussion. And it actually, for our countries, which come from mainly from the socialistic economies, it's very hard to understand that some institution has to be like an independent arbitrator in the energy issues. As for the regulatory environment, the commercial environment, it is important to have an independent regulator which can adopt the unbiased decisions. Consumer protection, of course, comes as one of the priorities, because at the end, why we do create this energy union, why we do fight for certain principles of internal energy market, the consumers. The consumers are the receivers of the benefit, or at least of the expected benefit. Now, moderation of demand, it's energy efficiency part, and I'm not going into detail very much. Again, I just want to say that export of the EU law and the requirements are of crucial importance to have our neighboring countries understanding the importance of the energy efficiency and changing the habit of the overall consumption. The fourth aspect is decarbonization. The renewable energy agenda is, of course, one of the crucial aspects in this regard. I mean, you have to be blind not to understand that the future lies in the renewable energy. And if Lithuanian officers don't have the guts to say that the nuclear power plant project in Lithuania is dead, decapitated, and buried, I can say so. Because after so many years of development, there is absolutely zero progress. And now, actually, setting apart the progress itself, the political cooperation and this and that, even the technology itself which was chosen and which is now being built in the third countries, I mean, or in the developing countries, but not in Europe, it has to be completely reviewed. So the future lies, of course, in the energy mix, largely based on the renewable energy. Now, alternative fuels, of course, is in the agenda, especially having in mind alternative fuels and joint regional efforts. Now, for joint regional efforts, I should say that first of all, what is very interesting thing in this winter package and the reviewed regulation 994 is that the reverse flow will be done mandatorily to all the countries, and even the protection of vulnerable customers in one country, if the necessity will arise, will have to trigger compulsory supplies from another member state. Now, this is the level of joint regional efforts. Of course, we will see lots of discussions, lots of opposition for this requirement, but of course, it's a very extremely good proposal from the European Commission. And the final, research and innovation. As regards the foreign policy, I mean, this is the EU's mainly internal aspect of researching new developments, new technologies, because now Europe, well, honestly, is lagging a lot behind the United States and even China. So this is one of the internal triggers. The external triggers is how the European Union will be kind to its neighbors and will share the technologies, the existing potential in the energy, in new trends with the countries, with the neighboring countries which don't have the monetary or, let's say, human capacities to undertake or to participate in those developments. Now, finally, I just want to finish my today's presentation with one example. 2 years ago in Vienna, we were discussing with a very well-known Russian energy expert and advisor to the Russian government for energy purposes. And at that time, he said that thinking that Russia is a threat to someone is nonsense. And then we discussed unofficially, in the corridor, and said that, well, as a Lithuanian coming from the Baltics and knowing our history, you have certain standards. And after a couple of months, all the crisis in Ukraine got lost. And so in this point, I just want to say that our biggest external supplier, Russia, is not some mythical threat. It is a threat, lurking in the shadows, not acknowledging the basic principles of the law, of the rule of law. So now what the European Union member states and its partners extending the borders of the European member states have to do is to cooperate, to be prepared, to avoid any other crisis. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for your discussion.